Hello. Today I'm going to talk about a medieval New England, or the Anglo-Saxons' Eastern Odyssey to the Byzantine Empire and the northern Black Sea coast. Obviously today when we talk about New England, we tend to think of America and the English colonies established there in the post-medieval period. But something rather different was meant. Before that New England, there was an earlier New England. And we're going to have a look at this medieval New England in a little more detail. And it was indeed called New England, as we shall see. The topic of people travelling a very long way in the medieval period and being where you really wouldn't expect them is one that I find endlessly fascinating. There is a preconception of the medieval period that tends to say that most people stayed where they were, or if trading was taking place, it was with nearby countries at best. But actually some people did make enormous journeys, whether in fiction or in fact, and this is something I've been looking at recently. There's various examples we can give. King Arthur, obviously a non-historical figure according to most historians. He was often said to be very busy in England, but he also conquered an empire overseas as well. You can see him riding on a goat there from a 12th century southern Italian mosaic pavement, or facing up to a giant. He tends to get in these mystical battles, but he also conquered a great empire, supposedly. And one of the places it was claimed in the medieval period that he conquered was the Arctic Circle. Now, we don't have great sources for this, but they are fascinating. And they seem to borrow the Norse legends of Vinland and the conquest of Greenland, and instead give them to King Arthur. And I find that quite interesting, but it is a fictional example. There are real examples of people travelling extremely long distances from England and Britain in this period, however. This is a particular lovely one. You can see there on the top right an extract from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle written in the later 9th century, telling how King Alfred the Great of Wessex sent from Winchester envoys all the way across to the eastern coast of India, Mylapore, with gifts for the shrines of St Thomas and St Bartholomew. This has often been doubted. As you can see, it's an enormously long way, as the Google Earth image shows you, but the map on the left is an Anglo-Saxon world map, which does include both Britain in the bottom left corner and India at the top, suggesting they had some knowledge of it. And I would argue this actually probably did take place, because there were Christian shrines to St Thomas that people in Europe and Western Europe, and indeed in Anglo-Saxon England, knew about. So that's a lovely example of a real journey that probably did take place over incredible distances in the medieval period. Another rather lovely one is this. This is a little bit later. We're now into the mid-13th century, and the Mongols have conquered this absolutely huge Eurasia-spanning empire that you can see in red there. And they are looking to conquer Europe. The armies of Europe are very fortunate that the Mongols all retreat back into their lands in order to contest the overall rulership, and so they get some relief, and they leave behind them Englishman. And chronicles at the time talk about the Prince of Dalmatia taking prisoner an Englishman, and it turns out this man had an incredible journey. He started off in England in the 1230s roughly, sailed into the Mediterranean, disembarked at what is now modern Israel, then wandered into what is now modern Iraq and Iran, then finds his way across to the Mongol capital in Mongolia before showing his gifts for languages, which the Mongols appreciated, so they take him with him as they turn to Europe to conquer it, and bring him almost all the way to the gates of Vienna before they turn back, and they leave this poor unfortunate behind to be captured. But that's an incredible journey, and again, something that really happened. So, with that as a preface, I think we need to look quite seriously at what I'm proposing today. These extremely long journeys can take place in this period. And what I want to look at today starts roughly in the same area, probably on the south coast of Wessex, travels through the Mediterranean, but this time goes through Constantinople and then into the Black Sea to found what you can see there is Nova Anglia, New England, as it's described in chronicles and sagas of the medieval period. So how does this tale begin? Well, it really begins with this, 1066 and all that. The Battle of Hastings takes place. King Harold dies. We're never quite sure whether he's the man on the left with the arrow in his eye or the man on the right being struck down by a sword. But nonetheless, Harold is dead. William of Normandy is now in charge. And the English nobility are deeply disgruntled by this. They make multiple attempts to take back control of England from the Normans in the first 5 to 8 years or so of the Norman conquest. Some of these are more successful than others. You'll have heard of Hereward the Wake and people like that potentially. But ultimately, by about 1074, 1075, the English nobility is beginning to realise that this just isn't going to happen. One of the last Viking kings looked like they might come along and provide salvation from the Normans, but it didn't work out in the end. And as a result, according to 2 medieval texts that we possess, a large number of English nobles decided to pack it all in. Okay, the Normans have conquered England, we're going. These 2 texts are the early 13th century Leon Chronicle and the 14th century Icelandic saga of Edward the Confessor, or Edward's saga. They're 2 reflections of the same events, as we shall see. They have some slight factual differences in them which are interesting, but fundamentally we think they're probably based on lost 12th century accounts of real deeds. This is what the Edward saga says. When the English chiefs were sure that the Danes would not help them against William, then they left their estates and fled away from the land with a great host. How big the host was? One source says 350 ships, the Leon Chronicle says 235, but nonetheless a very large number, probably numbering several thousands. The exiles are led by 3 earls and 8 barons, among the foremost of whom was an Earl of Gloucester named Seward. He is an interesting chap, because he does seem to appear in the historical records. There is an Anglo-Saxon lord of that name who actually joins Hereward the Wake's famous rebellion against the Normans in 1071, and he does seem to have owned land in Gloucestershire, so this may well be the person we're talking about. The English fleet sets sail for the Straits of Gibraltar before voyaging around the western Mediterranean. Raiding and adventuring. Now, the Edward saga gives us a little bit of detail about that. If you just go back to that map, you can see I marked Septum on there, the Straits of Gibraltar. They supposedly, that's modern Ceuta, on the north coast of Africa, and they supposedly slew a great host of heathen men and obtained a great fee in gold and silver, which enabled them to continue on their journey. They travelled to Minorca and also raided there before sailing out into the Mediterranean itself. When there, they learn of great strife out of Micklegarth, the Anglo-Saxon or Norse name for Constantinople. Now, Constantinople was the capital of this polity in the eastern Mediterranean. The Byzantine Empire, that's roughly what it looked like in about 1100, much reduced from where it once was, because this was the Eastern Roman Empire. It's the rump, it's what's left of the Roman Empire after it's been eaten away from both the east and the west and the south by various contesting armies. Now, supposedly, the Anglo-Saxons in their ships heard that heathen folk beleaguered the city of Constantinople by both sea and land. Here's Constantinople. You may recognise some of these images. One of the great churches there, built in the 6th century by Justinian, then the walls of Constantinople on the left, and then an overview of the city itself. It was one of the great cities of Christendom. We often forget, when we're dealing with medieval period, to look at the East. The East still had a beating Christian heart in this period in Constantinople, and it saw itself as a great power, and it continued to resist attempts to conquer it for many centuries after the period we're talking about now. It was one of the great cities of the medieval period, inhabited by significant numbers of people, maybe not as large as it was at the end of the Roman period, but nonetheless still extremely important and a focus for many people. So they get there. They arrive, according to the Leon Chronicle, in 1075 and fight so boldly against the heathen folk, who are presumably the Turks, who did indeed threaten Byzantium and Constantinople around this time, that the emperor supposedly offers to take them into his service. He's so impressed with these Anglo-Saxons who have turned up with their 300 or so ships and helped defeat the Turkish foe, that he invites them into Constantinople and to become his personal bodyguard, the Varangian Guard. That in itself is quite fascinating. Neither the saga nor the chronicle text reveal what the Anglo-Saxon exiles actually made of Constantinople. But it was one of the greatest, most populous cities in the world even then. It still had its massive defensive walls. Marley and Mango has shown that it still probably had its Roman-style porticoed streets and monumental architecture even this late. And I'm sure that they would have been impressed by the remarkable Cathedral of Hagia Sophia. Must have been awe-inspiring when compared to English cities of the time, where London was the largest with maybe 6,000 people, barely even small town status by modern era standards, and other towns equally, roughly around the same level or smaller in England at the time. We do know, however, that it offered them a wealth of new experiences. The Chronicle account of one of those exiles is a man named Hardiet. And here you can see the text from the Leon Chronicle. He was reputed to be the strongest of all the Angli, for which reason he was suspect by the Greeks. This is the term, the Greeks is what they, the Chronicle text and Norse texts refer to the Byzantines although they themselves refer to themselves as the Eastern Roman Empire and Romans. He was alone in the courtyard of the palace. Unfortunately, the Greeks had cunningly let loose a lion to devour him. He ran to the marble columns that stood in the atrium of the palace to use them as protection against the lion, and then he succeeded in braining the lion by bashing its head upon one of the columns. It then goes on to tell you another story of him. The result of this was the emperor is so impressed with this man that he appoints him the leader of all his guards, and not long afterwards made him commander of the naval forces. Now, obviously, this is a early 13th century chronicle, probably dating from the mid-12th century in terms of its source material. It sounds a little fanciful, but actually we know from more sober historical documents that the animals of the zoos of Constantinople, including lions and leopards, were released to attack those camped outside the walls of Constantinople in 1101. So it is actually entirely plausible. So this is a story. They stay there for a period of time. They lead the naval forces, they command the emperor's personal guard, but eventually they grow tired of the life, or at least some of them do. And according to the Edward saga, they sail across the Black Sea in the direction pointed by the arrow, across to the Crimean Peninsula and the north coast of the Black Sea. It seemed to Earl Seward and the other chiefs that it was too small a career to grow old there in Constantinople in that fashion, that they had not a realm to rule over, having been expelled from their own kingdom of England by William the Conqueror and the Normans. So they begged the king, i.e. the Roman emperor there, Alexius, they begged him to give them some towns or cities which they might own and their heirs after them. But the king thought he could not strip other men of their estates. So what seems to happen, according to this, is that the king tells them he knows of a land lying north of the sea which had lain of old under the rule of Byzantium, but the heathens had won it back and abode in it. And the Englishmen hear this and they take a title from the Emperor of Constantinople. He allows them that the land should be theirs if they can expel the heathens in his name, which they supposedly go off and do. And then we hear how Earl Seward and his men come to this land, have many battles there, and got the land won, but drove away all the heathen folk that abode there. They took that land into possession and gave it a name and called it England. That at least is what the 14th century saga says. The Leon Chronicle, written in the early 13th century, gives it a very specific name, Nova Anglia, New England. And then it goes on, the saga, to the towns that were in the land, and to those which they built, they gave the names of the towns in England. So they came across towns that already existed and renamed them, and they built additional towns there. And they gave them names of the towns in England, such as London and York, and the names of other great towns in England. It then goes on to tell you that they didn't want to practice Eastern Orthodox Christianity, St. Paul's law, but sought bishops and clergy from Hungary. And then it says that the land that they conquered and settled lies 6 days and nights sail across the sea in the east and northeast from Micklegarth. Now, contemporary sailing instructions make it clear that that is about the normal sailing time to get to roughly the area of the Crimean Peninsula in this, helping confirm exactly where they supposedly went to. And the saga finishes, there is the best of land, and fat folk have abode there ever since. Now, it's a wonderful tale, isn't it? And the question I want to ask over the rest of the course of today is it credible? Did it happen? You can see on your right there a rather lovely map that we will be coming back to in more detail in a minute. It's a 16th century Portolan showing the Crimean Peninsula and the northern Black Sea coast and the Sea of Azov. And we will come back to that in more detail. These portlands were first created in probably the early 14th century, although there may have been earlier versions as well. Those are the earliest we have surviving. And they are fairly consistent, as we shall see, and have some really interesting place names on them. In the first, though, I want us to look at evidence from within England for how credible this all might be. We need, at the beginning, to say that while it is a very long way, an effectively 10,000 kilometre round trip by boat to Constantinople and back, there were certainly close links between pre-Norman England, Anglo-Saxon England and the Byzantine Empire. This is a lovely example from Winchester. It is a seal from a Varangian's contract of service. The Varangian Guard is the Imperial Guard, the Emperor's personal bodyguard, and we actually have a seal from one of their contracts of service found in Winchester, the Anglo-Saxon capital of England, from around about 1030 to 1040. And it doesn't stand alone. We've got lots of evidence there of Greek travellers in Anglo-Saxon England. There is a Greek monk called Constantine living at Malmesbury in the 1030s who plants a vineyard and loved working in it. There are a bishop in the later 10th century, one of the king's magnates of Greek origin, who wanted to become Bishop of Ely. So we definitely have some toing and froing going on, and it goes a bit deeper than that as well. This is a distribution of 11th and 12th century Byzantine coins and seals in Britain, representing both coins in terms of trade, probably resulting from Byzantine traders visiting England potentially, or alternative souvenirs brought back by people from England who had been to the Byzantine Empire, and also seals as well, which would have either come on contracts or on bales of goods and so forth. These are very heavily concentrated at Winchester and London, the capital and the major trading centre in southern England at the time, which is telling. There clearly was something going on here. And these are some of the coins we find. You've got there a lovely contemporary imitation of a Byzantine Emperor Alexius from the Mint of Constantinople. That somehow made its way up into northern England. You have a beautiful gold coin there of the Byzantine Emperor Michael VII, in whose reign the English Varangians are said to have arrived in Constantinople. And what's really interesting here is it's pierced in just a way that it would have been when worn, displaying the image of the emperor, which is interesting in itself, particularly when we look at these next finds. This one at the top is a disc from a pendant showing the Byzantine Empress Theodora of the mid-11th century, found in Hertfordshire. Again, it's not actually a coin here, although it could be mistaken as such because the backside is blank. It's actually from a pendant. These are people wearing Byzantine images in late Anglo-Saxon England. Another example here, Romanus III, a silver Byzantine coin. You can see the it's been gilded and mounted as a pendant here again. Here's some of the seals that we talked about. This is a rather nice one, a Byzantine seal of the Emperor Alexius I, found at Torksey, Lincolnshire. Alexius is, of course, that Byzantine emperor, the Emperor of Constantinople, who is said to have given the English their New England, a new homeland, now that they've been expelled by the Normans. The one below, that comes from slightly earlier, probably. It's from the Ministry of Finance at Constantinople, the great city, Micklegarth, centre of the earth. That was found at Queen Hive, London, at the great trading settlement that existed there. And it's not just ordinary people who are wearing these things and displaying the images of the emperor, making use of coins, and traders buying things, and maybe Varangians, English people serving in the Varangian Guard even as early as the 1030s. The kings themselves in England were fascinated with Byzantium. This is a seal of King Edward the Confessor, who died in 1066 and precipitated the Norman takeover. And you can see on there, top left, he's using the Byzantine title Basilius. And he's not the only Anglo-Saxon king to do this, but we have his seal surviving, and that is in itself quite fascinating, as is the fact that when you actually look in his coffin, he was buried in silks that probably came from Constantinople, and there's some fragments in the Victorian Albert there of the silks that he was buried in, decorated with panthers and griffins. He was also buried with a Byzantine pendant around his neck. So we're really talking a strong penetration of Byzantine culture into England compared to what might be easily assumed for this period. All this is great. It tells us what's happening in England. It tells us that people in England were familiar with the Byzantine Empire. They were interested in it, and they may have had some contact with it and influence from it. But we have more direct testimony that helps to confirm the two narrative accounts of New England that we possess. First of all, we've got some Greek sources. So the advices to the emperor, it was written in the late 1070s and then revised for the next couple of decades, and that complains explicitly that the emperor favours the foreigner who has come to us from England, making him head of a department of state or general. That's exactly what the Leon Chronicle and the Edward Saga are saying happened with Hardit. And that's quite a dramatic confirmation of that element, at least, of the account. We also have an account of a visit to Constantinople in 1090 by a monk named Joseph from Canterbury, who relates that he encountered men from his own homeland and his own friends who were part of the emperor's household. Again, confirming that the emperor's taken them into his personal household here. Jocelyn of Canterbury, similarly, dies in around about 1100, so a contemporary. He makes a reference to an unnamed honourable man from England who could well be Seward or somebody like that, one of the leaders of the English fleet, who, along with many noble exiles from the fatherland, migrated to Constantinople. Direct confirmation. Here. He obtained such favour with the Emperor and Empress, as well as with other powerful men, as to receive command over prominent troops and over a great number of companions. He then settles in Constantinople, marries a noble and wealthy woman, and remembering the gifts of God, built close to his own home a basilica, a church, in honour of the blessed St Nicholas and St Augustine, his patron. So we have contemporary confirmation of what at least part of those narratives are telling us. We also have some physical confirmation as well. You can see that on the right, another Byzantine seal, not found in England this time. This one is a late 11th century Byzantine seal of someone with the name Sven. Again, good, solid, Northern Anglo-Danish name, who holds an imperial title and is known as the translator of the English. So, we've got good evidence that something definitely is going on in this period. Just to return back to that account of a church being built, we do actually think we know which one it was. We think it was this one. He married a noble and wealthy woman, built a basilica, a church in honour of the blessed Nicholas and St Augustine. We think it is the church of Bogdan Saraye, Istanbul, Constantinople. It's often identified as such, and in fact there is an account with its origins in the 19th century, that the tombstones of the Varangians still existed on a tower in the vicinity of that church. Unfortunately, at the request of the British ambassador that they would be removed to the British cemetery, the Turks used them for building purposes instead, and a copy of the inscriptions which were taken was accidentally burnt in 1870. Nowadays, the remains of the church in question, you can see in the top picture there, it's being used as a tyre store. So rather sad, but nonetheless, we seem to have some physical evidence here, not only of the church that was built, but also the tombstones of the English Varangians as well. One final piece of confirmatory evidence comes from the history of the Church of Abingdon, a 12th century history thought to have been written around about 1117, which tells us of high-ranking Anglo-Saxon emigrants who actually returned to England as a Byzantine ambassador, an ambassador from the Eastern Roman Emperor himself. So here we have the text. It is worthwhile to recall briefly how the Church of Abingdon obtained the arm there of a Eastern saint. Emperor Alexius of Constantinople at that time sent to England letters and gifts for King Henry I and Queen Matilda. In that embassy, Wulfric, an Englishman by birth, native of the town of Lincoln, performed with great pomp. Wulfric of Lincoln, is sent to Abingdon Abbey, that you can see in the top right there, and to England, and to meet with the King and the Queen as the Emperor's own ambassador. And it goes on to say, he was very bold in his close relations with that Emperor, and sought and received from him these relics of the Blessed John with a view to the uplifting of his homeland. So he brings back relics with him on this embassy. Must have been quite a thing to be sent back to England as an ambassador. Presumably he had left it as a very young man. It says he was a native of the town of Lincoln, but he's being sent back in the early 12th century here with gifts for the Normans who had taken England away from the Anglo-Saxons. Interesting that he was from Lincoln, incidentally. Lincoln nowadays seems a smallish provincial city. Back in this period, it was one of the great cities of England, with enormous amounts of trade taking place there, and great connections all over the place. That is a lovely example down there you can see of a 12th century narwhal tusk, probably from the coast of Greenland. That was used in 12th century Lincoln, one of a pair, beautifully carved, probably maybe as candlesticks or processional cross holders or something like that. But again, showing links over long distances, in this case to the coast of Greenland in the 12th century for Lincoln. So, we have this situation. We have solid evidence that the English do emigrate to Constantinople. They do become very close with the emperor and get given important roles, such that the Greeks begin to complain about it, such that they act as ambassadors. And it's now generally accepted that the evidence indicates the Varangian Guard of the emperor was dominated by Anglo-Saxon warriors through the 12th century and into the 13th century as well. As late as the mid-14th century, in fact, Greek writers in Byzantium was still observing this curious fact that the Varangian Guard, the emperor's personal guard that you can see there in that 12th century manuscript image, in their golden outfits with their traditional Anglo-Saxon style axes there, that they were English. He relates that the Varangians were still, in the 14th century, constituted a separate people of themselves, and that at Christmas these Varangians wished the emperor length of life in their native tongue, that is, English. So they had kept themselves a separate people, and they continued to speak English as late as the 14th century, despite 200 years roughly passing since they had come to Constantinople. So the question is, what were these English-speaking imperial guards doing? Where were they based? Presumably they had to have a base where they were able to retain their distinct cultural identity and their language. And this, I think, is where that account in the Edward Saga and the Lone Chronicle of Nova Anglia, New England on the northern Black Sea coast, really becomes quite convincing. Because, yes, if they're maintaining their identity that late, they're going to have had to have a base. And why not that one? Can we prove it, though? Well, let's go back to our Portland that I mentioned. It's fascinating. It is 1553, this one, but Portlands are extremely conservative and they maintain the names over many generations of copyings and recopyings and redraftings. And this one has a few interesting names. If you recall, to the towns that were in that land and to those which they built, they gave the names of the towns in England. They called them both London and York, and by the names of other great towns in England. Well, this is one example that we can spot on this Portland, the Porto de Susseco. Now, this has been investigated, the place names of this area, by Jonathan Shepherd, a British historian, and he demonstrates, I think very convincingly, that we are seeing a genuine English name here, recorded on an immediately post-medieval Portland, but also it occurs on the medieval Portlands too, right back to the 14th century at least, when place names start being recorded on charts. And Sussexo, he notes that the Saxo element is almost certainly Saxon in this. I think it probably reflects Sussex. The kingdom of the South Saxons and later the territory of the South Saxons was known as Sussex within Anglo-Saxon England, and this is the port of Sussex, I would suggest. It doesn't stand alone though. Just to the west of it, you can see Flumlundia, the River of London, it looks like. This is an interesting one, but it always occurs as a river name, but it's thought that it almost certainly was a river named from a town that wasn't called London, that must have been inhabited on its banks. And again, we've got these two next to each other, a Sussex and a London on the north coast of the Black Sea. What else do we have? Well, we have these three names as well. These all contain, in various forms, the term Varangian, as in the Varangian Guard. You've got Varangaliman, which is the port of the Varangians, Vagropoli, their city, and then another possible one up at the very top right there on the Sea of Azov. It's not actually recorded in its full form on this Portland, but it does appear on some Portlands as another Varangian name. In addition to this, we have a 12th century Syrian map of the world, which seems to have drawn on lots of rather interesting materials. And what's particularly interesting is it labels the Sea of Azov as the Warang Sea, the Sea of the Varangians, and this is a map of around about 1150. In other words, we have an awful lot of Varangian names in this area, along with at least two names which look to be derived from English places. That seems to me quite significant. But it's not just this 16th century one. We can go back to the 15th century. This is a 15th century one. I've highlighted again those the 4 names that appear on this one with Varangian or London or Sussex in them. Here, to go back even further to one of our earliest portalans, there's only 3 here. So Lundina, the river of Lundina, it doesn't appear on this one, but the Porto de Susseco does appear on the right hand side. This one's made probably around 1327 to 1331, and you get the full form of Varango Liman there, the port of Varangians. And you can also see Vagropoli is indicated in red, suggesting it was a place of some importance in the early 14th century. That's a point we will come back to. Now, these place names continue to circulate. They gradually drop out in some places. The last of them to drop out is Sussexo, which continues to be used right through until this map that you can see here on the left, probably of the 1770s. The map from the 1630s, you can see there, still has the river of Lundra, the port of Susseco, and Susseco itself marked separately. But by the time you hit the late 18th century, only Susseco is being marked, and it disappears subsequently from maps. There has been an enormous amount of changing of hands in this area and renaming of places, so this isn't unexpected. But it is worth noting that these were actually quite persistent elements in the toponomic landscape of this area. So can we locate any of them? Well, Lundina and Susseco are our best bets in some ways for really interesting locations. Lundina, first of all, we think it was in roughly the area of the red marker there, Archipo. Now, the river here is the river Vulan, and that is usually identified as being the river Lundina. It's nowadays a Black Sea resort of around 8,000 people, and the current settlement originated as a Cossack military settlement in 1864. However, there's clearly some earlier activity here. As we know, there's a Roman fortification with lots of pottery and various other things that have been turned up here as well. So it's not implausible that there could have been a city of London after which the London River was named, the Vulan, before that was then renamed once again. This is what the Vulan River looks like, incidentally, now. The other one, of course, is Sussexo, which is our last surviving place of interest. This is from a 1769 map, and you can see it's still marked on the coast there. It appears to the east of the Lundina on the medieval portland. So if the river is the Vulan, then it must be to the southeast. It's been suggested that Tuaps may be the place where that is. However, we do actually have testimony from an early 19th century traveller to the region prior to the major 19th and 20th century changes. And as far as he knew, he seems very clear that there is a Turkish fortress in Russia, on what is now the site of one of its main ports on the Black Sea, and was its main port until 2014, of Sudshuk Kale. Now, the argument runs that this name, the Turkish name for a fortress there, contains Sussex, and while there are etymologies available for it, it's not an implausible explanation. I mean, the 19th century traveller says that in local dialect, perhaps Sudshuk means something like the sausage fortress, which seems somewhat unlikely, whereas if it was inheriting an earlier Sussexo and renaming it, that might explain the unusual name. However, if that is Susseco, then the river Vulan cannot be the river Lundina and the site of the city, the presumed city of Lundina, so that would have to be relocated if that's the case. But it is something worth bearing in mind, and the early 19th century accounts do seem quite convinced that that is where Susseco was. There is a nice map from 1750 to 1777, incidentally showing the location of that Turkish fort, Sudshuk Kale. So, those are our places with English names. What about the Varangian names? Well, those are less controversial, it seems. There are three identifications which I've marked on the map for you there. Parthenay on the south coast of the Crimean Peninsula is particularly interesting because archaeological work there has turned up a very large amount of Middle Byzantine materials, particularly 12th, 13th century, suggesting it was a significant Byzantine settlement in that period, which works really nicely with the narratives we're talking about and the identifications that are being made. The other ones we don't have, as far as I'm aware, any side archaeology for, but that may simply be that it's not recorded in the materials I've looked at, or it's not been looked at the right sites so far. But that one we definitely do, and that will be Vagropoli. So that's quite fascinating in and of itself. So there we fundamentally have the case. We have these two texts of the medieval period that tell of the Anglo-Saxon emigrants fleeing England in around about 1075, reaching the Byzantine Empire, working closely with the imperial forces in Constantinople, becoming friends with the emperor, who gives some lands in the northern Black Sea region. And then we have a host of material that seems to support this narrative, showing both an interest in Constantinople and Byzantium within Anglo-Saxon England itself, and also that Anglo-Saxons did turn up there, and there are places with the right names in the areas that the texts say the Anglo-Saxons settled. Before I leave you with that to ponder upon, I will give you a couple more pieces of evidence that will tend to back up what we've been saying so far. The first of these is a set of letters and a contemporary eulogy, which alludes to the restoration of Byzantine influence in the northeast of the Black Sea, around the Crimean Peninsula, leading into the Sea of Azov, in around about 1100 to 1107. That matches up remarkably well with what's being suggested in the saga and the chronicle, that the Anglo-Saxon takeover of New England in the Crimean Peninsula and the northern Black Sea coast area was part of a strategy of Byzantine reclamation of those areas. So that's very nice. Even more tempting, however, and interesting is this account of from Franciscan friars writing in the mid-13th century, in the 1240s, who record that as they're passing through that area, they record the existence of a people called the Saxi, which sounds awfully like the Saxons, who live in cities in the area. Interestingly, they are not heathens or pagans, as most of the people supposed to be in this area were. They are described quite clearly as Christians, and they live in cities in the Crimea and around the Sea of Azov, and they not only live in cities, but they are very good at warfare and successfully defend themselves against the Mongol hordes of this period, the Tartars, unlike the other people in the region. So here we have the extract itself. When we were there, we were told that the Tartars besieged a certain city of these Saxi and tried to subdue it. The inhabitants, however, made engines to match those of the Tartars, all of which broke, and the Tartars were not able to get near the city to fight, owing to these engines and missiles. At last they made an underground passage, and bursting forth into the city, they tried to set fire to it, while others fought, but the inhabitants posted a group to put out the fire, and the rest fought valiantly with those who were penetrating into the city, and killing many of them, wounding others, they forced them to retire to their own army. The Tartars, realising they could do nothing against them, and that many of their men were dying, withdrew from the city. So, we have an otherwise unknown Christian people living in the area of the Crimea and the Sea of Azov, who are living in cities, are extremely skilled at warfare and able to defend themselves. It does sound awfully like that is one of the last references to the Nova Anglia of the northern Black Sea. Okay, Thank you very much for listening.